Professor Jörn Birkmann is at the University of Stuttgart's Institute of Regional Development Planning, where he focuses his research on urban development, spatial planning, and looks at how vulnerability and risk result from natural disasters and climate change. He's also one of the authors of the Intergovernmental Panel's on Climate Change's latest report, Climate Change 2022 Impacts, Adaptation and Vulnerability, the second part of its sixth assessment report. Professor Birkmann, welcome to the Climate Pod.
Thank you very much for the invitation.
Well, it's great having you on. Let's start with a high-level understanding of what has just been released. This report looks at impacts, adaptation, and vulnerability. What were some of the key questions the IPCC wanted to answer with this report?
I think one of the key questions is, on the one hand, to assess the actual impacts observed, but then also to look into the future. So what are near-term risks, what are long-term risks, and what are determinants of risk? So actually, how does an extreme event actually translates into an extreme negative impact?
And let's kind of drill down into what an actual climate risk is. How does the IPCC define what climate risk is?
I think in the last report, in the fifth assessment report, we already identified or quite clarified, I would say, that it's not just the physical phenomena that matters for humanity, but also for ecosystems. So it's, on the one hand, the hazard like floods, extreme precipitation, heat waves, storms, but it's also the exposure of people. For example, low-lying coastal zones, the number of people or the percentage of a population is important. Also, the global urbanization process in Asia, but also in the United States and Latin America, contributes most likely to a higher exposure of people to sea level rise. On the other hand, it would be a bit strange if we would only look at exposure, because, for example, in the Netherlands, the amount of or the percentage of population exposed to sea level rise is significantly higher compared to Bangladesh. But still, I think the most vulnerable countries are actually those that have less financial resources or less institutional capacity to adapt and to mitigate risk. Therefore, the third important pillar is actually vulnerability of humans and ecosystems as well as infrastructures.
Well, how many people are currently living in one of these hotspots of high vulnerability to climate change now?
Yeah, that's a hot debate, but we looked actually at quantitative information, and we found that was interesting for us that the agreement on the most vulnerable countries and regions between different indices that use sometimes different indicators is quite high, compared, for example, to the lower level of agreement on exposure. So, for example, depending what kind of storm tracks you take, what kind of flood information you have, and what kind of sea level rise information. But in terms of human vulnerability, there's a high agreement between global indices where the most vulnerable countries are. And we then calculated actually the number of people living in most vulnerable regions and countries versus those that live in lower vulnerable countries and regions. And it's clear that around 3.3 billion people live in highly vulnerable context conditions, while around the half is living in less vulnerable context conditions, including, for example, North America and Central Europe. Even though you can also have in Canada and in the United States have very vulnerable groups, but you would probably agree that the governance conditions, the financial conditions are much better compared, for example, to hotspots like Mozambique, Somalia, Afghanistan, parts of India where you have a high poverty rate, etc.
That is an incredible number of people around the globe already living in high vulnerable spots to climate change. And I think, one of the things we talk about on this show a lot is how do those risks increase if we do not mitigate the worst outcomes and the worst level projections of warming that we could have with climate change. What are some of the potential increased risks that we could face in the future?
I mean, definitely the adaptive capacity of a lot of people is constrained. For example, we talk about additional sea level rise and salinization phenomena, but also storms. So storm tracks might change. And here it's important that people can prepare themselves for it, be it in terms of a better early warning system, but also housing structures or even flooding. And it's most likely that some of these global hotspots face already very strong challenges actually to develop adaptive capacities. So even moderate climate change would push these kind of regions towards irreversible losses. So could be that people are losing land, that they lose houses, that people actually die. And just to give you a number, fatalities due to floods, storms, and droughts are 15 times higher in the last 10 years in these most vulnerable regions compared to low vulnerable regions. That gives you a kind of magnitude also of climate justice, because these regions were less probably those who contributed to the phenomena of climate change or anthropogenic climate change. So this makes it actually also an imperative for us to think about adaptation. And one of the challenges we found also, it's not just individual countries. I mean, you see larger clusters in Central America, in Africa. So just thinking that local and national adaptation programs are sufficient is probably not the only truth. We might need actually more international cooperation if you want to get into a position to fight, for example, poverty, but also forced migration, etc., in these kind of clusters.
You mentioned that climate change is already making it harder to adapt. Have we already reached some limits to our ability to adapt to climate change?
Yeah, that's definitely a strong discussion. I mean, on the one hand, there's a part also in the report on habitability, but also in the discussion with governments we had in the last 2 weeks, it's quite clear that some governments or that the definition of what a real tipping point or an irreversible loss in terms of society is controversial, and definitely, for example, the relocation, large-scale relocation for small island development states is not really seen as an adaptation option. Even one could say from outside, if people are then living in Australia, it's also adaptation. So here, definitely, we face probably some limits. They are not reached yet, but we see also significant fatalities due to extreme events that are an indication that we are not sufficiently in the position to reduce risk and to adapt, particularly some population groups. So I don't think that we have the likelihood that New York or London or Singapore would somehow drown underwater. These cities have the capacity to build very strong structures and support people, but we have other regions where kind of support regimes are not there and where it takes longer actually to adapt.
Yeah, I mean, the science is clear. And while adaptation or limits to adaptation are scary, it doesn't seem controversial. What do you think? Why do you think that this subject of tipping points was so controversial during this process?
I think the entire issue of who is most vulnerable, who has lowest adaptive capacity, who should get the funding for adaptation is definitely quite political, because on the one hand, for example, if it comes to vulnerability, there's often argument you talk about specific population groups or a community. But if it comes then to the question, whom should we actually name as those who need the climate funding, then sometimes countries want to be named first. So I think here a certain difference can be observed. But in terms of the tipping points, it's also a question sometimes of what are the desired adaptation goals. So in some regions, I mean, actually also in the US or in Europe here, we could also say maybe it's useful to reduce exposure in some areas that are heavily exposed, for example, to flooding. Is that already a tipping point, or is it rather a kind of logical reorientation of urban development out of some river basins? So these are things sometimes also quite difficult sets of questions, and it's not easily to universally answer that. Or migration, forced migration due to floods, to droughts, El Nino phenomena. Is it already a tipping point, or is it somehow an adaptation process? So here, I think the discussion, the scientific discussion, can provide material, but the final decision sometimes is with people or governments.
And we know that the vulnerability and the impacts really vary throughout the world. How did the IPCC reflect that inequality of impact and vulnerability in this report?
On the one hand, I think we looked at various impacts and on different systems. So water, agriculture, not conventional, but the normal sectoral approaches. On the other hand, we really tried also to assess human vulnerability in a qualitative and quantitative fashion or a way in order to underscore that there are different facets. So for example, this marginalization process, as the Amazon, there's a specific box on it. But also, for example, indigenous population groups in the Arctic. So here, definitely, we reflect that at different scales, spatial scales, you can have different facets of human vulnerability, I would say. and or clusters of human vulnerability. But definitely also, as we see actually with some of the destabilization processes ongoing at the moment in terms of wars, these kind of national support regimes are quite important. So adaptation is actually not just adaptation to a specific climatic hazard, but also, for example, social security systems are quite important, particularly in the adaptation chapter, whether you have an insurance, whether you have access to healthcare, health insurance, that makes you less vulnerable in the case of extreme events.
Well, even in highly developed countries, we've seen vulnerability to climate impacts on full display. Last summer, in your home country of Germany and other European countries, flooding cost hundreds of lives and hundreds of billions of dollars in losses. How is this an example of our need to speed up adaptation efforts?
Yeah, that's a good example. I'm not sure how much the international information is here, but definitely, for example, in the flood-affected areas, it was heavy precipitation. So it was interesting that this kind of heavy precipitation could have come down also 30 kilometers further north or west, and then suddenly it would have targeted Bonn, the old capital. So here, I think the idea to relocate people out of heavy precipitation areas is quite difficult because it could rain everywhere. However, I think the challenge is at the moment the country has allocated 30 billion euros, which is quite a lot for a rural area in Germany, which is good and important. But now the challenge starts, it's winter time, so people want to actually have heating, they want to rebuild fast. But on the other hand, we want to ensure that some of the rebuilding also considers actually adaptation goals. And the question is, what are then specific adaptation goals? I could nail it down to which houses do you want to rebuild? Is it actually useful to have a playground for soccer directly on the river, or is it better to allocate it on a hillside? So these kind of discussions are ongoing, and it's not very easy because, for example, the insurance industry at the moment mainly pays for the losses. That means the adaptive capacity don't increase if you just rebuild the vulnerable structures which were there before and have been proven to be very vulnerable. And here, additionally, there's also schools, homes for people with disabilities where 10 people died in the flood event. That's quite a tricky thing because you cannot overnight find alternative locations, but definitely there's a need to improve the situation. And here I think it's a good case study, even though funding is available or certain funding is available, it's still a challenge if you're not prepared to develop adaptation measures, then it's very difficult actually to insert this in the rebuilding process. We have seen that also after Hurricane Sandy or Storm Sandy in New York, in New Orleans. So here you have to be prepared in order to ensure that when you have to rebuild, then that you directly adopt better measures or more adaptive measures.
Yeah, this report talks a lot about the importance of climate resilient development, especially during the rebuilding process. What is climate resilient development?
That's a good question. You have to ask the authors that wrote it. But I think the interesting part is I think it goes beyond the idea that just weather radar would help Somalia or New Orleans. So I think here the idea is really that you have to have an integrated strategy or integrative strategy, looking at equity issues as well. So it's not sufficient just to try to push the hazard away or whatever seawalls, but really to think about the societal composition to ensure that equity and vulnerability is reduced, and also to ensure that short and long-term adaptive capacities are kept. I mean, we have seen that in New Orleans, for example, after the dike construction, levee construction, a lot of urbanization took place behind the dike without protective measures. And this also was, I think, an accumulation of risk rather than a reduction of risk. But definitely climate resilient development pathways should strengthen the idea that we focus on a solution space. It's not just about reporting the risk levels and severity, and it will be another crisis, but also trying to identify points of intervention, of support. But it's not very easy because it's a very global report, so it would be not appropriate if we just refer to one specific region in South Africa or try to identify things which could work in Central America or in the United States. Therefore, I think it's still an abstract level, but it clearly hints towards, for example, the need for vulnerability reduction. So it's not just hazard, it's the exposure, it's the vulnerability. And here I think the final part on climate resilience really points towards this need for broader societal development.
Well, you were the coordinating lead author on the poverty, livelihoods, and sustainable development sections of this report. What's the difference between climate resilient development and sustainable development?
That's tricky question. I would say sustainable development goals, if you refer a little bit more towards the SDGs. But I think the climate resilient chapters, if you look into the report, also heavily actually refer to SDG goals directly or indirectly. And to be honest, also the vulnerability indicators we use at a global level, which are sometimes also not very much agreed, 60% of that are actually SDG related in terms of access to healthcare, access to education, reduction of poverty. I think there's a certain overlap, but climate resilient development probably puts a stronger emphasis towards climate and resilience rather than the broader SDGs. So the SDG is a broader framework, and I would say the Paris Agreement, but also here the climate resilient development discourse seems to be more specific towards climate-related development pathways.
I want to circle back to something you were talking about earlier in the conversation, which is the human health impacts that we are already seeing due to climate change. What did the IPCC note when it came to the actual human health impacts that are ongoing right now?
I think there's a larger chapter also on health that really underscores that's on the one hand direct effect, but also traumatization due to extreme events are issues which have to be taken into consideration. The unequal access to health care and health care provision. The health status of people is an important issue if you talk about human vulnerability and the predisposition to be adversely affected. So I think that the health is has a stronger focus compared to AR5, also potentially because of the COVID crisis. So particularly also this COVID crisis underscored the need to have a stronger focus on health. And maybe what I would say, what we observed, I mean, we're not looking at the current military crisis in Ukraine that was not on our radar, or it was not a topic when we wrote the report. But I think the COVID crisis also points towards some of the challenges. What happens, for example, if you get more poverty in certain regions? What happens if you're not in the position to travel, to commute? So here specific groups are also, I think, getting more vulnerable and have more severe challenges to adapt to, I would say, a cascade of risks. So it's COVID plus climate change. I think that is also a strong message. And if you look into the new poverty or new poor due to COVID, you will see that these are also actually then again areas where we already identified global clusters of high human vulnerability. So Sub-Saharan Africa, South Asia, where a lot of people lost access to their livelihoods resources due to this COVID pandemic.
You know, beyond vulnerability and risk, we are already seeing loss and damage. And loss and damage is one of the most critical subjects in the global conversation on climate change. And as we've noted in this podcast before, it has also been one of the most contentious subjects, as many rich nations around the globe have attempted to block efforts to provide financing mechanisms for loss and damage that have occurred. And we've heard from other people, including a former IPCC lead author last week, that the United States in particular has tried to block language around loss and damage in this report. What was the process like for the IPCC around the loss and damages portions of this report?
Yes, I cannot answer a question directly to this confidential negotiation process, but I think the challenge is sometimes that some countries are questioning whether the loss and damage is actually due to climate change or due to other factors. In the context, if you think about human security, or if you think about poverty reduction, it doesn't matter that much. I mean, definitely the climate signal is important to be understood, but if it's a combination, if it's a complex risk, that's also sufficient. I mean, if your population is first displaced by war and secondly by a flood event, then it's still a need to address these also in national adaptation or regional adaptation programs. And here I think the debate is sometimes a bit narrow, but definitely some countries would also say if you can detect more precisely the specific contribution of climate change to losses and damages, then the question around compensation payments is more precise. But as said, I think it's in some cases it will be quite difficult to directly attribute, for example, a specific number of fatalities specifically to a climate phenomena. On the other hand, if we just look at the global average, it's clear that those who are losing most are not those who contributed most to the problem. Therefore, I think there's also, a sufficient level of evidence that climate justice and these issues should should get into the forefront. We had a longer discussion about the word colonization. So colonial structures also influence, for example, current development patterns and adaptation gaps. And there were some governments who were quite critical that the word colonization would not be the correct term. But I think also acknowledging this historic dimension for some countries is, I think, appropriate. And at the end, the term is referenced to in the document, or is a point in the document itself.
Yeah, you mentioned the report was not written during the Russia and Ukraine conflict, but the report was being finalized as Ukraine was being invaded by Russia. Ukrainian scientists worked on this report. How did these events of recent weeks impact the report itself?
The report itself, I would say, has most of its data and evidence before, or was developed before, so there was no direct intervention. It was interesting for us to observe a little bit what the Russian and the Ukrainian delegation commented on the crisis. And actually there was quite overall picture, and also other governments really pointed to that a war is another destabilization that doesn't help, and that it's not really or leads to a lot of losses. And so far as I know, even the ambassador of the Ukraine to the United Nations cited an IPCC author, or the Russian head of the delegation in the IPCC negotiations, as saying that the war has also very negative sides, and most likely the Russian delegation will also feel that these kind of comments are at the moment quite difficult to be discussed in Russia itself. But I think there was an overwhelming statement by various governments that this current crisis also shows the need for intensive international collaboration. And I think the IPCC is probably a forum and a scientific, well-developed network where international cooperation really takes place between scientists and governments. I think that's also quite important. Normally, it's a bit untasty to be present in a process where your own work is discussed sentence by 190 governments. It's interesting to see that. So the meaning of certain words you have never thought about comes up, and some governments say, oh, this cannot be said, or whatever, population development is a no-go for us. We cannot mention this term. But on the other hand, I think it's a good example of international collaboration, how it should normally work between scientists and governments. And we probably faced, I mean, on the one hand, Ukraine, but also the former, I think, US government was not a super best practice example of international cooperation.
Well, this report talks about increases, just kind of switching gears here. This report talks about the increases in the number of maladaptive responses. What are maladaptive responses to climate change?
Yeah, I mean, for example, you could adapt to climate change. A family in drought exposed in Africa or somewhere else could adapt to drought by not feeding the elderly, so then they die. That probably is not an envisaged good adaptation. Or if you, for example, build a levee or a dike, and then you build single-story houses behind it that can be easily flooded, where you don't have an escape route, that is probably also not helpful. In addition, we are seeing actually that some adaptation measures are taken on the expenses of the most vulnerable populations. So here, this is also definitely something where I would say it must be an inclusive development, and has to prioritize or at least acknowledge the most vulnerable groups as well. So we see that some adaptation measures actually push most vulnerable people again on the margins, or into, for example, areas that are particularly exposed to climatic hazards. And last but not least, maybe one more point, I think if you also develop certain strategies that would lead to an accumulation of risks, that is probably also something where I would say this is a maladaptive adaptation. And if you look at the definition of effective adaptation, it's really about, for example, also reducing societal inequalities, addressing the broader picture. And if you have, for example, a warning system that only helps the richer 10% of the population, that is probably not seen as the best adaptation measure.
Well, this report also talks about hard adaptation limits and soft adaptation limits. What is the difference between hard and soft adaptation limits?
I think the discussion here, it's important the IPCC acknowledges what is the published literature saying about it. So I think the idea behind hard adaptation in the past and present is often that there are physical limits of being able to adapt to whatever, to a certain level of sea level rise for small island low-lying atolls. And soft limits are probably, or we refer more towards, for example, institutional barriers or funding that can also be probably made available. But more and more, I would say there's a kind of agreement that both have to be assessed. And some governments say we would have to talk about constraints rather than about barriers or limits, because limits, again, would require that you have a specific definition when a limit is reached. For example, if 5% of the population in your country are dying, is it actually an adaptation limit? Or would you say, oh no, the country is still resilient because 95% have survived? So here, this kind of challenging difference, or the scientific discussion is definitely also looks at a broader spectrum. And I would say the emphasis at the moment is a bit more to understand these different types of adaptation constraints, be it financial, be it governance related. I think governance has gotten a more we looked more into governance issues than before, and sometimes it's also quite controversial because some policymakers perceive that as policy prescriptive. But on the other hand, I think the report is quite clear. You need integrated strategies. You have to link local, national, regional approaches, and you have to consider social justice issue if you talk about adaptation effectiveness. It's not just the effectiveness of preventing water to come into a house.
Yeah, and just to wrap up here, the report cites an adaptation gap. What is an adaptation gap?
Yeah, that's also a nice or interesting discussion we had in the last 2 weeks. I think the adaptation gap normally refers to the difference of adaptation goals and actually implemented adaptation or adaptive capacities. So in this regard, the question is a bit, what are actually adaptation goals and who is defining them? Most likely, if we look at international agreements, there are some goals, for example, that people should not die due to extreme events. So this could be kind of measure. But since it's a global report and also adaptation is often thought to be local, I think in the report, there's not a direct quantification of this. But I would personally say the human vulnerability, the relative difference of human vulnerability is also something which could inform the adaptation gap, because if it's not just about the hazard, then also these different development capacities, different development constraints are quite important. And reducing poverty should be actually part of adaptation.
Are there other ways in which you'd like to see us bridge that adaptation gap in the coming decades?
Yeah, I think we are going into this direction, but sometimes, we have looked very much at sectors like agriculture sector, food sector, transport, and I think it will be important also to have cross-sectoral adaptation strategies and actually probably to promote goal setting like the SDGs. What are our adaptation goals? In terms of mitigation, I think we have a more precise understanding how much emissions we want to reduce. But what is actually our adaptation goal? What is the adaptation goal for your city? Is it somewhere related to a temperature in terms of heat? Is it somewhere related to the number of people who are suffering? Is it so what are the adaptation goals we really have? And I think here we are still, politically and also planning-wise, still a bit weak. We often say we want to adapt, but what does it actually mean in terms of precise goals for development?
Well, Professor Birkmann, this is an extraordinarily important report for policymakers, for the general understanding of what is happening with climate change. And we don't know how hard it is to put together a report like this because we've never done it, but we know it's extraordinarily hard. And all your work and effort and the efforts of your colleagues could not be more critical to this global conversation. And it's so helpful to our podcast to have you come on the show and explain these critical aspects of the report. So thank you again for joining us today on the show.
Thank you very much for inviting me.